can start this second session. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Diana Lopez. I'm the Dissemination Manager of the ERN EuroBloodNet. This is the second session of the Synthema and ERN EuroBloodNet educational program on artificial intelligence and its applications in hematology. This program consists of a series of 4 webinars that are held every Friday during May, and all the presentations and recordings will be uploaded to a ERN EuroBloodNet website and YouTube channel. So welcome. Some housekeeping notes to have in mind is that your microphones will remain muted during the presentations. Please note also that this webinar is being recorded for the main objective that I mentioned before, that will be shared through our channels. And also you can submit all your questions via the chat box during the whole duration of the session. And after each presentation, each speaker would be able to answer to your questions, and also at the end of the session. So we encourage you to write down your questions on the chat. And also, if you need to activate and turn on the Zoom AI translation captions, you need to check on the CC box at the Zoom toolbar at the bottom, and then click to turn on the translation and select the speaking language and also the translation language. So this session 2 is titled Regulatory on Medical Devices, AI Act, Privacy Preserving and Ethical Considerations. And the speakers of today are Nathan Lea from the European Institute for Innovation Through Health Data, Rudolf Meyer from SBA Research, and Sophia Tsekeridou from Netcompany SA. So welcome to the speakers also. And I will give the floor to Nathan, that is the first one starting. We see your screen, Nathan, so all fine.
Excellent, and I hope it's the right one this time as well. Oh, sorry, everyone. It seems to have jumped ahead. Forgive me, that was a little unusual. Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Apologies for the slight little technical hitch there. As we've heard, my name is Nathan Lee. I'm the Information Governance Lead and the Data Protection Officer for the European Institute for Innovation Through Health Data, where our mission is to help to enhance outcomes, innovation, and research through the effective, safe, and societally acceptable use of health data. It's my absolute pleasure to join you this morning to talk about this area in terms of regulation within the bounds of synthetic data. And I'm going to lead you through our story within Synthema, looking at regulatory compliance with the focus on medical devices, the Artificial Intelligence Act, which was enacted a couple of years ago. And I'll hand over, of course, to Rudolf and Sophia, who will look at more of the privacy assessment considerations and the technical security implementation as well. So we're hoping to give you a good overview in this session on how we've addressed regulatory matters, but also some of the practical approaches we've taken to try and uphold a good standard for privacy protection and for compliance. So just for my little part of the session, I'm going to lead us through 3 main areas. First is to understand the evolving regulatory context. So we've had a lot of legislation that's been enacted, especially in the last 3 years, across the European Union and the European Economic Area. And there are implications, of course, for activities such as ours, especially for innovation and research. But then I want to focus on some of the challenges for how we go about developing synthetic data generation techniques and how that data may be used and governed. Then I want to talk about how we're addressing those evolving compliance needs in Synthema, because it really is a fantastic real-world example of applying these regulations in practice, especially as they're still developing. So with that, I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes. I think we'll have time for a few questions, but I'm happy to take them at the end of the overall session as well. So, understanding our evolving regulatory context. Thinking back, when we started Synthema, in fact, when we were bidding for Synthema, there were several regulatory frameworks that were essential, of course, and it's a complex tapestry of different regulations, laws, guidelines, and so forth. But in broad terms, our focus was around the data protection considerations through our old friend GDPR, as well as research governance considerations as well. So these require considerations around independent ethical oversight, making sure that data that's been gathered for one purpose can be reused in our context, but also looking at participant protections, including where there have been informed consent for use of data, but as well as that, the transparency around the use of data. So those regulations were relatively well established. Research governance laws that tend to occur at member state level have been around for decades. So they're relatively well tested. But in the new order of higher amounts of data usage, digital intervention, and with the new laws, especially around GDPR, a lens needs to be applied using those considerations as well. But what was interesting was artificial intelligence has been quite a big topic now. It's become much more operational actually over the last decade or so. It's not a relatively recent thing. The sophistication has improved, of course, for the provisions, but we've been looking at AI governance, ethics, and deployments for a good while now. And what happened back in 2019 was that the European Commission appointed an expert working group to come up with AI recommendations for the trustworthy use of AI. Um, and this working group put together a very helpful assessment list for trustworthy AI. It's a self-assessment for anyone looking to deploy AI in any scenario in the business or research sector, including health. So the Altai, as we call it, the assessment list for trustworthy AI, was already there in 2019 and helped inform a lot of our work in the early noughties, but also underpin a lot of the AI Act drafting and implementation, which I'll go into shortly. One thing in Synthema, though, that we hadn't quite focused on in great deal was the applicability of medical device and in vitro diagnostic regulations. Partly because the role of synthetic data and the governance of AI in particular hadn't quite reached the stage where the standards that would be required by the incoming legislations had been defined. So we hadn't considered it in great detail, but we knew it was relevant at that early on. But then, of course, we were very aware of the considerations and sensitivities around rare disease cohort requirements as well, given that they tend to be smaller populations, more easily identifiable in research that's looking at pseudonymized or de-identified data sets and had specific needs given the rarity of the condition. So we were quite clear on those, but how the medical device regulations would apply wasn't quite so well defined, or whether they would at all for synthetic data generation. However, let's fast forward to today and understand how the regulatory context has evolved and is still evolving. So, as you can see here, we've got a host of the different legislations that I mentioned earlier. So, GDPR, of course, research governance, AI trustworthiness, they're still very alive and kicking, but we need to look at those with a newer lens of all the new regulations that have been enacted. Now, the focus for today is on the AI Act, of course, which has that link to medical device and in vitro diagnostic regulations, which I'll talk about shortly. But there have been other regulations as well that have come to pass, which have a bearing, which I won't focus on too much, but I want to give you an indication of. Anyway, those include the European Health Data Space regulations, as well as the Data and Data Governance Acts. But if all the new regulations weren't enough, there have been digital omnibus proposals as well from the European Commission and other expert working groups. This is about trying to make sense of all the new regulations and making sure they all interplay well with each other. So I will refer to that because there's a direct relevance between the AI Act and the medical device and in vitro diagnostic regulations as well. So, um, as I was saying, in light of all these changes, the kind of safe space in inverted commas, we could say that we'd reached with the GDPR, with research governance regulations, we had needed to look at in with a different lens, of course, with the requirements around AI, working practices, new methods, new technologies, but also how those need to be interpreted in a way that's going to be enhancing regulation, enhancing implementation, and enhancing innovation and research. So these don't come out as boilerplates. There needs to be some thought and consideration. Um, so it's also the specifics around implementation are also shifting. It's important to bear this in mind because even though the AI Act and the European Health Database regulations were enacted in 2024 and early 2025, respectively, um, the enforcement of them is coming online gradually. So to put it into context, originally the proposals were that medical device and IVDs AI powered. The AI Act provisions would come into enforcement in August 2027. With the digital omnibus proposals, that might be pushed back to 2028. So things are shifting. There's some speculation as to what things look like specifically, despite a raft of standards and so forth and guidelines that have been issued, but nothing's been decided yet. I will refer more to this as we move forward, but it's not like we have a cheat sheet or notes on how to implement this. We have to explore and evolve, and that's why we're delighted to speak to you today to helpfully empower you to be ready for the future. But the other thing to bear in mind is that GDPR interpretation in courts and in laws have been evolving too, and exactly the same thing will happen with the AI Act in particular. So it's worth bearing that in mind too. So in terms of things like definitions of anonymization, pseudonymization, for example, there's been a landmark case about a year ago where there's more clarity on how to define pseudonymized data versus anonymized data. But some of the particulars will also come into play as well. Even though the AI Act, in my view, is something of a developer's and an engineer's dream, it's a very technical regulation that gives you good guidance on how to frame your development approach, which we'll go into. But as I was saying, the precise requirements are not yet fully enacted or indeed understood. So we're working on that as best we can. The learning from Synthema will help that. But one last thing is to say we can comply with as many laws as we possibly can, but it's just not enough. When it boils down to it, the trustworthiness of our activity, of our systems, of the innovations that we provide need to be maintained to a high standard. And in broad terms, if the public don't trust something, it's going to lose support. So we've got to demonstrate trustworthiness, not just to our clinical, our research, and our technical stakeholders, but also to our patient communities and the wider public to show that we really are doing our best to protect data, their rights, and information. Otherwise, the support for it will fall away, as we saw in various examples over the years, on and off, where legally compliant initiatives had to be cancelled. Some of us may recall the care.data proposals back in the UK about 15 years ago. As lawful as that might have been, the public had a distaste for it. And in the end, the Department of Health pulled the plug on it. So we've got to make sure we go beyond just compliance. So what are the challenges for synthetic data? There were four broad ones I thought I'd just share with you that we knew about when we started Synthema. Regardless of what you do, there's always some privacy risk of privacy violation with synthetic data. So there's potential for re-identification. The project was exploring and has been exploring, and Rudy is going to tell us more about some of the techniques for that. Those, of course, have direct implications for GDPR and ethical implications as well. And despite the fact that privacy was a huge area for Synthema, so is the technical security of the solutions, which Sophia will talk about a little bit more towards the end. But when it boils down to it, the challenge for Synthema and the other synthetic data generation projects and innovations is trying to find that balance between utility of the synthetic data, fidelity to real world cases, as well as privacy. And that there is some suggestion. There's been one study, I think it was undertaken by the Wellcome Trust a couple of years ago, where they did a small focus group on public attitudes towards synthetic data. And the general feeling was that even though it was a small group, it was a small discourse, we had there was a consideration that there was a preference for less faithful data with greater emphasis on privacy from that group. But I suspect those attitudes will change as we understand better the utility of synthetic data in use and work. But it's got to be borne in mind that people do generally consider privacy a high priority and that that balance will need to be continually addressed as we move forward. But what are the new challenges with the new regulations, especially with the AI Act? So, the use of synthetic data to train medical devices or in vitro diagnostic devices will need to be quality assured. Now, this is something we hadn't quite appreciated when we drafted the proposal for the project. No one had. But when developing these devices, we'll go into this shortly, but the AI Act does have a high standard and categorizes things according to risk, which I'll go into detail shortly. But a high risk system would generally be applied to a medical device or an IVD. And if you're using synthetic data to train these up, where does that land the synthetic data generation approach? Does that make it a high risk AI system? It's not a medical device in of itself. Being used to develop a medical device. But where do we sit there? The answer is we're not entirely sure, but we've assumed a high risk scenario with Synthema. And within the AI Act and the ALSI, there's a much greater emphasis, as well as the EHDS for that matter, on looking at data quality, missingness, and bias in the data set. So that's something that the synthetic data community needs to address with greater relish. This is a particularly challenging issue in rare disease cohorts. And also, when it boils down to it, a lot of what's in the AI Act and the ALTI comes down to the training of models and transparency around how that's done. So, what is the quality of the data that's being used? How is it being used to train the algorithms? How can we explain how they work? And how do we, oh, excuse me, and how do we articulate that not just to our stakeholders and to the regulators, but as well to the public as well. So we need to keep training records for the models. We need to have extensive record keeping to be able to explain why decisions were made and design choices were made. And that's something that needs to be addressed as we move forward. So just very briefly, because time is short and we do have a lot to get through, I mentioned the Data Governance Act and the Data Act as well, because they do have a little bit of bearing on data usage. A lot of the focus is on non-personal data. This is about data related to use of goods and services, machinery, learning, that sort of thing. They create provision for data intermediaries to hold data on behalf of customers and so forth. Less relevance for Synthema, but still not irrelevant. But it's also worth bearing in mind that the Digital Omnibus is looking at merging those two regulations into the Data Act and disbanding the Data Governance Act, even though a lot of the provisions will remain. This is more about how one might share and make available data and manage it. And again, not just for personal data. So there may be implications further down the line, but I won't focus too much on that today. The European health data space as well, it's important. So there's going to be a huge impact on health data holders, care providers, registries, and so forth. Health data access bodies will be created. And it's also got provisions around the storage, management, and use of data for primary care purposes and secondary uses that have been defined. So there's implications there for access management, but again, less relevant for today. We can talk more about that after, of course. But it also outlines the operational playing field for data handling and where you might fit in synthetic data facilities but it doesn't have very much to say on the governance and management of synthetic data itself. And there's going to be a 5 to 6 year schedule for deploying all this. So it's something to keep on the horizon, especially around developing new tools and so forth. But it's not something that's a priority for today. So, just to give you the overview of the AI Act and the assessment list for trustworthy AI, the AI Act is a regulation in European Union terms, so its provisions are directly applicable into member state law. And it's a risk management regulation, a lot like GDPR. And it has that provision around indicating what kinds of AI systems should be considered high risk. Now, as I mentioned, components of medical devices or in vitro diagnostic devices, as well as a host of other examples, which I won't go into now, these are all considered high risk systems. So the stricter provisions will apply, which I'll pick up on shortly as well. But the Altai self-assessment, it's not a regulation. It's more of a self-assessment as a guideline document. It's very useful. The 7 criteria sets I've listed here, most of them are reflected in the AI Act. If you've been using the Altai for a few years, you're in a really good position to get started on AI Act compliance. But I mention them here because in our solution for Synthema, we merged the requirements as we understood them for the AI Act with the Altai self-assessment. The Altai has more of a focus on societal and ethical considerations, environmental considerations, and so forth. And so in terms of demonstrating the trustworthiness aspects, we felt this was a good approach. And I'll show you that shortly. But broadly speaking, what does a high risk AI system need to address? It must have risk assessment and mitigation systems, quality assurance systems, and so forth. So, in terms of processes like data protection by design and default, in terms of quality management systems and standards like ISO 13485 on quality management systems, you have to adhere to these as best you can. You have to look at security risks, security breaches. You have to look at quality of product development. Data quality is also vital and bias needs to be addressed, as I've mentioned, and logging of the activity of the system whilst it's being developed and whilst it's being deployed is important to ensure traceability of results and explain how an AI system operated. In our case, why did it choose to generate synthetic data of the form that it has? Documentation is, as always, important, but a lot of this does rely on GDPR documentation as well. So if you're doing that well, you're in a good position. But then you have to be clear to users of the system and how it works and what the implications are for moving forward with that. Human oversight is vital to minimize risk in these kinds of high risk systems. So the operation of the synthetic data generators needs to be understood, but thereafter, in particular, any devices that are developed need to be carefully monitored as well. So we have to have that standard of documentation of record keeping to be able to allow medical device manufacturers to refer back to that. And when it comes down to it, the robustness, security, and accuracy must all be evaluated, but independent review by a notifiable authority or a competent authority is required as well if you want to bring an AI system to market. And that's going to be very strict with medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices. So, with that in mind, it's still not clear how medical devices and IVDs powered by AI systems will be assessed. There was concern that with a high risk system, you'd have to go through a medical device certification as well as the AI high risk system certification as well. Now, that seems excessive. And this has been recognized in the Digital Omnibus recommendations, where firstly, the common sense view, I think it's fair to say, as well as the recommendations, seem to indicate you'd follow the medical device or IVD regulation process for certification, and the AI Act requirements are bolted onto that process. So you only have one aspect to go through. So has huge implications for anything that's been developed by synthetic data. And even if the AI system isn't brought to market, you're still expected to reach the high risk criteria standard as well, which is why we've taken the approach we have with Synthema. So I won't go into this now because I know time is short, but you should hopefully have access to the slides or you can see the recording afterwards. But this is how the process of notification and certification will go within the EU. So every member state will have its own notification body, and the various bodies will assess, hopefully in line with the medical device process or whatever the synthetic data generator is going to be fitted into. That's what we're anticipating and hoping for. So that's an area of AI governance. The AI notification board will oversee everything. And like I mentioned, this all relies on the quality management systems and internal assessments as we're going through here. So that's the pathway if you do go down the certification route. So how are we dealing with this? Um, we came at this from a research governance and GDPR foundation. We were complying from day zero as best we could, spinning up a data protection impact assessment, which helped cover the project, as well as develop a requirements for our data management planning, artifacts like our joint controller agreements, but also to start to flesh out some of the AI requirements as well. So the DPIA, following the data protection by design default approach, we routinely update. And this has provided a foundation for which we could do the exploratory work, the AI Act compliance. And this allowed us to do a deep dive and to move towards a consideration that the medical device requirements would apply as well. So when it came down to it, IHD, our institute, has developed which is ongoing work. We've developed a set of high-level compliance criteria for trustworthy AI compliance and AI Act compliance. We've merged the requirements from the ALTA and the AI Act have gone into a deeper, more detailed set of criteria for compliance, and there are about 150 of those, a lot of which relate to market authorization. But it may seem like quite a lot, but we don't know it until we try it, which is why it's been important to move forward as we have in developing this and applying it to Synthema, where our Work Package 5 and Work Package 7 activities are assessing against these criteria and working them into the wider ethical considerations as well. And here in a snapshot are the 16 sets of compliance criteria, which may seem familiar. How we've managed risk and quality, how we look at system robustness and security considerations of the system, general safety considerations about what the impacts might be in use, documenting the technical requirements, the technical implementations for the platform, governing the data itself, assessing its quality, looking for bias and representation, management at the data source. The list goes on and on. A lot of the analytics and transparency are also fed from the informative approach taken by our GDPR activity, as well as some of the other considerations around environmental impacts, how this might impact the workforce, and where human agency and autonomy needs to be met. So where people are able to oversee the outputs of the synthetic data generation and check for ambiguities and peculiarities. Communication and explainability remain important as well, even though this may end up being a component in a wider study. We need to be able to make sure that people understand what we're doing. But these are a checklist and they may help with certification efforts, but they're not the end of the story. I think the word is tenderizes or softens everyone up for meeting the requirements, but there's standards like the ISO 13485, adherence, quality management for medical devices that will help with your approach as well. Looking at these sets of criteria, answering the questions can help ready you for that and aligning it with a good data protection and independent ethical oversight strategy. So the assessments are ongoing. Some of the criteria are easier to assess against than others. We do need to validate them against evidence. So where you've got data governance considerations, referencing to the data protection impact assessment, the agreements, codes of conduct, and the technical security considerations, which you'll hear more about shortly, are important. The assessments for the privacy compliance also provide an evidence basis to do this. For things like societal impact, we have to speculate somewhat and the environmental considerations. But that's work where I think generally there's better toolkits for assessing those too. So you're going to hear more about the technical and the privacy side of it shortly. These are huge parts of it, as well as the evidence basis. So just to wrap up, the compliance isn't a tick box exercise. Um, you need to be able to understand what you're doing and articulate it, not only to win the public trust, but also to deal with changes as they move forward. Monitoring of AI systems in the market will be a huge undertaking. And the more you comply with the regulations, but understand the context, the better you'll be at it. But bearing in mind the regulatory scene is shifting and societal expectations are shifting as well. Um, and when it boils down to it, founded this on evidentiary assessments is important, whilst also considering some of the risks moving forward as well. The synthetic data generators hopefully won't be used for things like deepfakes and all the rest of it, but there is some consideration about the deployment of the data as well. So, on that note, I'm going to thank everyone for your time just now and see if there are any questions that you might like to ask. My details are there. Keep in touch. Very happy to speak with you further on this. And of course, we'll take some questions now briefly so we can allow the others to finish too.
Thank you, Nathan, for this great presentation. We don't have any questions yet in the chat. So I don't know if you agree, we can move forward with Rudolph's presentation. And then if any question raised up, you can answer at the end of the presentations.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, then hello also from my side. I hope you hear me properly. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we see you.
Perfect. Good. Then, so as introduced before, I'm Rudolf. I work at SBA Research, which is a cybersecurity research center in Vienna. What I will talk about, I go a bit more into, as Nathan already teased, into technical aspects and details. I'll talk a bit about first what is personal data, and then disclosure risks or privacy risks that can happen when you share the data. And then also a bit towards mitigations, but then you will hear a few other mitigation settings also from Sophia in her last talk. So I guess a few of you have heard about how the GDPR defines personal data, but I just want to briefly recap that. So it's basically any data that relates and allows to identify a natural person. Quick example that I will use throughout the presentation. This is not a medical data set, but I took something that is very, very simple to easily illustrate. So if you would have a data set like this, where you have maybe people with social security number, names, birth dates, their sex, and maybe the salary they earn, then you have a lot of identifiable information there, and it obviously clearly relates to people. There's a few techniques that people have proposed to use to allow sharing of data, to make sharing of data feasible, less risky. For example, pseudonymization. I'll just mention this because I'll come back to this a few times later. Basically, this means replacing directly identifying attributes like your social security number, sorry, or your name with some pseudonym. But that is still personal data in the GDPR, at least of now. It might change a bit in the definition later, but at least of now, at least if you can come back, if you somewhere have a mapping, which pseudonym actually corresponds to which person, then this would still be personal data. And what we would like to actually have in settings where you need to share the data, or we need to at least outsource the data analysis to other people, is that we would have like anonymized data, which is then not personal data anymore, because it doesn't have this direct identifier, also not the indirect identifiers anymore. There's also debate about machine learning models. We have synthetic data generation that itself learns a machine learning model, and then afterwards you maybe train other machine learning models on the data. So there's also always a question, is a machine learning model personal data or not? Most experts, I think, would agree that it's not really, because it's aggregated data. It's not really containing individual information anymore. It has some abstraction from this. But what's also in general very important to consider when you look at privacy risks in general and want to assess them is that there is maybe a differentiation between what is theoretically possible for an attacker, a malicious adversary, to figure out about the data set, about data items, and what is actually practically going to be done. And GDPR is quite, I would say, clear on that, saying that things that might be theoretically possible, but are unlikely to happen. So there should be reasonable means that people will use to actually re-identify, to figure out about a data set. So even for it's maybe technically possible, if it's too expensive, too time consuming, and the gain that you would get doesn't stand in relation to the costs. So maybe it's theoretically possible, but it will practically not really happen. Then this is a possibility that you don't need to consider too much. So let's try to formalize a bit, or define a bit what kind of threats we can have to privacy or confidentiality in general in data that gets published, and that might be synthetic data or some other kinds of data. So the first risk that people mostly identify in the literature is the so-called identity disclosure, also sometimes called re-identification. Let's say you have this data set that I had from before, where you basically do not have any specific notion like who or to which person the first, second, or third data record belongs to, because you just have the pseudonym, or maybe you wouldn't even have the pseudonym. If I'm able to re-infer, for example, I have a colleague at work, and I know that colleague kind of is represented by the third record, then this would mean a re-identification. So I can say which person does this record belong to. This is likely the strongest form of disclosure that can happen, but there's also other forms of disclosure that can happen. For example, attribute disclosure is something where I might know some information about specific data records, about specific individuals. Let's say I have another coworker called Tom. I know maybe his birth date, his sex, but I do not know the salary, but I would like to figure that out. If I can do that by using the information that has been published, so maybe from some pseudonymous data set or something else, if I can then infer that, for example, Tom has a salary of 3,950, then I successfully have inferred this attribute, and the disclosure of potentially or very likely sensitive attribute has happened, something that the person didn't want to have disclosed. And the third kind of disclosure that people very often talk about is the so-called membership disclosure, which basically means that I know that a certain individual was part of a specific data set. That itself doesn't disclose anything I would have not known before, because I still don't know exactly which record it is, maybe. But I just know, let's say my third coworker is part of the data set. And then if I know that this data set is maybe a data set that is about a specific disease, and everyone in that data set will carry, I don't know, say maybe cancer database will carry that disease, then I would be able to implicitly infer sensitive information about that individual. So by knowing that the data point was in a certain record that has a certain meta information, I would have disclosed indirectly some information. Of course, if I can do the first kind of disclosure, the identity disclosure, and I know a specific record, I will be able to infer all the attributes if I would have not known them from before, and I obviously also know membership. So that's why it's the strongest form. So this is what you very often see in literature discussed by privacy researchers. This kind of maps also a bit to how the legislation defines it. So in the GDPR Article 29 Working Party definition, they define basically 3 criteria that you should assess to check whether your data is private or not. The first one is singling out, which basically means that I'm able to isolate one or multiple records in a data set, which basically means that if I can come back to this data set again, maybe I wouldn't have the names, but if basically on the birth date and sex and whatever information I might have available, if they are unique in this data set, so there's only one record that shares these characteristics, then they're singled out, they're isolated. That itself doesn't already constitute a privacy infringement, but it's basically an enabler for subsequent settings. And the next setting that they suggest to look at is basically linkability. And linkability means that I'm able to link one record from a certain data set to another record in another data set where these 2 records belong to the same person, so to the same data subject. To give you an example, it might be, for example, that I'm able to single out the first individual. And then if I have another data set that in the end contains information about that individual as well, and maybe there I have information about maybe a name or social insurance number in that other data set, I'm able to basically in the end re-identify this person. So if I can single out records and if I can link it, I might be able to do re-identification or this identity disclosure. The third thing that this working party defined was the inference, and basically inference here they mostly call it what I before described as attribute disclosure. So being able to infer values from a data record that I didn't know before. They don't specifically talk about membership inference, but in most data definitions, this is kind of implied as well. These confidentiality attacks, they're also mentioned, for example, in the AI Act. There's an Article 15 on cybersecurity. It also mentions that you should consider these kind of confidentiality attacks against machine learning models itself then. So this is basically the legal background why we need to look at this. Let's very briefly look at an example how I can actually do the linkability. So let's say I have two databases, and if I can match the records together from one database and the other one, maybe I have some attributes that occur in both data sets. These are very often called the so-called quasi-identifiers. So these are attributes that in combination uniquely identify people. So maybe the birth date and the zip code and the sex makes you unique in your own area. There's no other person of the same sex born on the same day. If I have this, for example, in one data set with medical data where I maybe removed all the identifiable information, so I removed the social security number and the name, I left also only other things in there. But then maybe there's another data set. This has been shown, for example, in the United States, we have maybe voting records where I have some attributes in common, and then maybe there I have a name in there and other things. And then I'm basically able to link the medical record, which didn't have personal information, to this external record. So the second data set needs to contain some of this personal identifiable information, like a name or something else, and then I can do disclosure. And there was some cases in the US, for example, they were able to re-identify quite a lot of people from public employees where they published the medical records, including the then governor of the state of Massachusetts. So this was some notable cases. So basically, via singling out and linkability, I might be able to re-identify. And this happens in many settings, many data sets that I can actually do singling out. So many data sets, you very quickly become unique because there's very few other records that have the same characteristics as you. So I don't know, in credit card transactions or also in general in demographics, you very quickly become unique, and a large portion of the individuals can actually be singled out. And there were a few other notable cases. For example, Netflix at some point released data that they thought was anonymous, but then people linked it to something else and re-identified people in there. So the question is relevant to the theme of our project and also this webinar is, how do these disclosure risks actually apply to in synthetic data? Because synthetic data is a slightly different setting than what we had before, where we maybe just release data that's maybe sanitized, we maybe remove identifiers and do a few other things. In a synthetic data setting, we have original data, and then from this we generate a model, and then from this we basically publish synthetic data in the end. What this basically means, we break the one-to-one connection. So we don't have any more data record where we remove some information, but the record essentially stays the same. We do not have this because a synthetic data record doesn't really directly relate to original record. So for a long time, people have actually argued that because of breaking that relation, there's actually no, or at least almost no privacy risk that can happen. So if I have this now synthetic data set with completely different birth dates and other characteristics, overall the statistics like how old people are and how rich they are and so on, they stay quite similar, but the individual records, they don't belong to anything that I had initially. So people thought this is quite safe, but this has also been challenged in the last, let's say, 5 years or a bit longer. And people have started to look more closely, like which of these disclosure risks that I've discussed before actually transfer to synthetic data. So singling out, linkage, inference, how do they apply? And also an important question here is like, what does the attacker actually have access to? because there might be different settings. Maybe you just publish synthetic data that was generated, but maybe also publish the model that generated data. So that's also a different setting. And then you can look at different ways to evaluate this, and I will talk about this too in a moment. So first, what is singling out? Means basically, as we said, making sure that, or like having records that by themselves don't share characteristics with other records. And of course, that's also possible in synthetic data. So it might be that the records that you generate, they are singled out because they don't relate to anything else. So that might happen, but we said before, singling out itself is not yet something that directly leads to disclosure. When you talk about linkability, as we said before, you normally need to link one record from this data set that is by itself maybe a bit sanitized already to some external database to basically then maybe infer again a name or something else. And this is basically something where it already gets difficult with synthetic data, or more challenging with synthetic data, at least from the attacker's point of view, because the synthetic record doesn't actually really represent a real individual. So there's actually nothing that actually perfectly will match this and can be linked to. So that's why people have actually looked at alternative things to measure. Maybe not saying, okay, can it be linked to other databases, which is anyway very difficult to determine, but basically looking at how close might synthetic data be to real data samples that you have in your database. So you can, for example, identify are there some exact matches in the data that you generate. So let's say I generate, I don't know, 50,000 records of some hematological disease patients. I could check, does any of them by chance have the exact same values as real patients? So exact same birthday and a few other characteristics. That's one thing to look at. And then you could also say, maybe it doesn't have to be exactly the same. If there's someone that is already very, very similar. So if the closest record to a synthetic sample is a very similar real record, then maybe this already constitutes some kind of privacy issue, and then this could enable linkability. So if I generate someone that is very, very similar to a real person, maybe this constitutes an issue. And then there's a few other things people have looked at specifically. For example, if you have outliers in your data, so patients that are very, very dissimilar from the majority of the others, it might be that these are maybe easier to single out and to potentially that they get recreated with similar values than original data. But overall, I would say there's still not really good consensus in the community, and there's definitely still a lack of, I don't know, court decisions and other tangible judicial experiences saying whether this itself constitutes a disclosure. So just because I generate samples that are similar to other real samples, that itself might not be a disclosure. It might also be that I generate samples that are very or exactly the same as someone who was actually not even in the real data that I used for training the synthesizer. So that's a debated issue. But yeah, this basically constituted the, let's say, distance or similarity based metrics. Many different metrics you can use. Literature has maybe proposed 10 to 20 different metrics to decide when it's also close enough. Quite difficult. When we come to inference, as we said before from the Article 29 Working Party, we can look at attribute inference as estimating the missing value of an attribute. So the attacker wants to maybe infer the salary of a specific person that I know some other attributes of. The attacker might have access to the generated synthetic data record. So maybe there's a data set of, I said before, maybe 50,000 records that has been generated. I could use that basically to do some statistical prediction on the most likely value. So in simplest case, I just compute the mean value over all the salaries, or I look at records that are generally similar and then compute the mean over that, or maybe I even learn kind of a regression model that will predict me the salary. So with this, I can basically infer or make an estimate of what this value would be. If I have access to the trained generator model, I could just use the generator model to generate synthetic data records, and then I have the same setting as in the first case. Or maybe I can use more information from the model in addition to make my prediction better. In the end, I have a relatively easy attack. I can relatively quickly give an estimate for a partially known record. What is this likely value going to be? I can also, in general, measure how correct my prediction is. So how far is it off? I can do this in evaluation settings. But if it's not categorical attributes, like in this example, the attribute sex, which is either male or female, but if it's salary, I can, of course, say the salary is only inferred correctly if it's exactly the correct value, but I could also say it's maybe inferred correctly if it's plus minus a certain boundary, because maybe I don't care exactly about the euro value, but I just want to know rough ballpark, does my coworker earn 4,000 or 4,300 or something like this. So easy to perform, can be numerically assessed. Still not easy to put in perspective. Is it actually a disclosure that happens or not? Because I could do similar guesses from other data that is available. So I don't know if the National Statistics Office publishes average salaries of people living in your capital city, and I can use this as an approximation. Maybe I get very, very close to that estimate I would get from the data as well. So still a bit difficult to estimate, is it a disclosure or not? So this was one of the inference settings. Of course, we can also in inference then look at membership. Again, as I said before, this is a record or was a record used to train a synthetic data generation model. And I can from that infer meta information, so maybe know that the person has a specific disease. This attack utilizes the phenomenon that machine learning models normally overfit to the data. So they basically better represent data that they have seen during their training data than other data. And this kind of helps me to infer whether a model has seen a specific sample during the data, therefore, if it was part of the training data. The attack is a bit more costly to implement than for attribute inference, because normally I need to then myself as an attacker train some other synthesizers that are similar to what I'm trying to infer from, and that might take a lot of compute and also requires me to have some knowledge, like I need to have some similar data. But if I have that, I can then basically, for example, learn another model that predicts the patterns. Is a certain data set part of the generator or not? So it's relatively costly and requires some knowledge. Again, the question is, when is membership inference actually an issue? Because what I'm getting here is I'm getting a prediction. My model says, yes, this record was a member or not. And this prediction is not always correct, obviously. So how often does it need to be correct? Does it need to be correct, I don't know, 2/3 of the time, 90% of the time, 95% of the time? If I'm going to ask a lawyer, they will for sure not say when it starts to become an issue. Again, there's not really any court decisions on saying when it becomes an issue. So we've seen a few of the attacks that you have in general in data, also in model publishing. They apply also to synthetic data. Now the question is, what can we do to mitigate that? So in first place, I would say using synthetic data instead of real data is already a way better mitigation than even if it's anonymized versions of real data. But to maybe reduce further the residual risks, you can, for example, do some operational or deployment measures. For example, you can limit the access to the generator model, so don't give that out, just give generated data out. Maybe also give only smaller sample sizes of synthetic data out. Of course, that might limit the end user experience, because they maybe need more data. They maybe want to generate their own data for their medical investigations or whatever. So that might be a disadvantage. You can also, once you generate the data, you could maybe filter out records that were generated that might be maybe risky, maybe that ones that are easy to be singled out or that could be linked. Or you could also already, before the training, maybe remove some of the training data like outliers. All of these might reduce the quality or utility of the generated data. Then there's also something you can do for the model training itself if you don't want to touch any of the above points. Or in addition, you could, for example, make the synthesizer differentially private, which basically means you add some noise to make the results less precise, which makes disclosure more difficult. Differential privacy is way too complicated to explain here, but as a main idea, it's a nice mathematical framework that actually allows us to also estimate disclosure risks that can happen, in this case, primarily for membership disclosure, very, very nicely, because we have a parameter that controls the residual risks that are still there, and you can make them as small as you want. Of course, that comes at the cost of some data quality, but basically we have a guarantee. And what differential privacy basically ensures is that if you would have two different data sets that contain or not contain a certain sample, you would not be able to tell that from the output whether that sample was in the data set or not. So basically I cannot do membership inference. How to do that? Quite complicated. As a teaser, you can do this both for data released, but you can do this for the model training, or you can do this for the outputs of the models. Different advantages and disadvantages, different difficulties to do this also. But in general, it's a mechanism that is relatively widely applied in machine learning. And by adding this controlled noise, I can basically reduce my disclosure risk. It comes at a computational overhead that might be bearable, but again, it comes at a reduced data quality and utility. So you normally have a trade-off, privacy versus utility, and whether the utility is the data quality, or as I said, maybe before here, maybe a limited user experience. There's normally always some form of cost, and it's in the end a risk management setting. How much risk do you want to still have with the data release versus how much is the cost from that? Good. As a quick summary, data publishing carries in principle disclosure risks, whether you categorize them in identity, attribute, or membership disclosure, or maybe more like a GDPR and singling out linkability and inference, doesn't really matter. But there are these residual risks there. Synthetic data in general removes this one-to-one connection from the original to the published data. So that's a good first step, and that reduces a lot of the risks already. But it doesn't necessarily solve all the problems. So especially the inference attacks, but potentially also re-identification are still possible. But this is still a very active discussion, both on the impact, the legal status of all of this. So it's very difficult at the moment to say exactly what would be required. There's some mitigations, as I mentioned, differential privacy, output treatments, and so on and so forth. Synthema actually will provide a toolbox for privacy assessment and also for differential privacy. And then Sophia will also talk about a few other techniques later that they will be, not everything is there yet, but they will be part of our public GitHub. And if you want to read a bit more, I also make some shameless self-promotion, because I was involved in a IEEE standardization working group on synthetic data. And there's a nice report about what privacy risks and metrics and what governance you might have to use for synthetic data. You can find this at this URL. I guess you'll get the slides later, so you can also find it there. So with that, thanks a lot for your attention. I'm not sure if there are questions or not, but I hand over to Diana.
Thank you, Rudolf, for this interesting presentation. Since we don't have yet any questions on the chat, I think that you can go ahead, Sophia, and then if any question raised up, you can answer at the end.
Okay, hello from my side. Let me share my screen as well. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we hear you, and now we are waiting for the... Not yet. Now we see on presentation mode. Okay. Thank you.
Let me also minimize that. So, okay, hello to everybody from my side as well. My name is Sophia Tsekeridou. I'm a Senior Research Innovation Manager at Netcompany in its Research Innovation Development Department, and also actually a partner in the Synthema project. Of course, the prior speakers have made a very good introduction, and Rudolf as well, on the privacy risks associated with data and synthetic data, and also mentioned one of the privacy enhancing technologies that we have used in Synthema, differential privacy. So I will more concentrate on further mitigation measures as Rudolf has presented them, especially associated with how we secure privacy in federated learning ecosystems. And Synthema actually has proposed such type of framework for the training of models in order to produce synthetic data, that is for synthetic data generation training and learning across distributed data provider nodes because Synthema deals with rare hematological diseases, as you heard in the first webinar, where data are really scarce from a single data provider. So in order to secure the volume and quality of the data sets, we need actually to access them from a distributed network of nodes. That's why we capitalized on federated learning. So as you know, what we still currently face are quite siloed data centers, and this limits very much data and AI-driven health innovation and its acceleration. And for this reason, the federated learning frameworks and ecosystems have evolved, as Federico mentioned in the first webinar, and particularly these have been found as really impactful in clinical contexts, but these contexts are quite heavily regulated, as you heard from Nathan, because clinical data providers need to comply with data protection regulations, GDPR, European Health Data Space Regulation, since personal sensitive data are involved and relevant privacy guarantees need to be ensured, especially when sharing data. So that's why federated learning actually has emerged, as I mentioned, because it enhances privacy and data protection by design. Since data are not shared, they reside on their hosting node, but instead algorithms move to data. However, apart from what you have heard already from Rudolf with respect to data and privacy in data as well, and privacy risks actually when sharing data or even within synthetic data, federated learning frameworks are also susceptible to data leakage or inference attacks. Why? This happens during the network communication among the different nodes and the aggregation server for model updates and aggregation of parameters. So not only the data themselves, but while the model is trained, this can actually lead, if the model updates are leaked, it can lead to privacy risks. So there are a lot of actually such types of attacks, membership attacks, gradient leakage. Rudolf mentioned some, but if you wish more details on privacy risks within federated learning frameworks, you can refer to the publication that I list here below. There is also in conventional federated learning frameworks where we have a centralized aggregation server. This is actually a single point of trust, or we can see later failure. Why? Because what happens if the aggregation server cannot be trusted? So this is actually a critical issue in privacy. What can we do actually to prevent that, or let's say to minimize the privacy risk in this case? One privacy enhancing technology is secure multi-party computation protocols that are actually applied on top of federated learning. So they come to the rescue. What does SMPC do? They compute functions like the computation of the model and parameters over set secrets that are held by different peers, by different nodes, without actually revealing them directly. So this actually contributes to a privacy-preserving aggregation of the model updates while the model is being trained, like the synthetic data generation model. So the key properties of SMPC protocols are privacy. So no party learns the other party's raw secrets. Correctness. There are mathematical guarantees that the computation is performed faithfully. And robustness, which provides guarantees even when there are malicious participants. And you can learn more about secure multi-party computation and different types of such protocols already published in the literature in this publication that I mentioned below. So in Synthema, actually, we will consider differential privacy that Rudolf mentioned, as you see here in the figure that Federico presented in webinar, as well as secure multi-party computation. And this is applied on top of the Flower Federated Learning Framework. How do we implement in Synthema the secure multi-party how SMPC protocol is implemented? Through additive secret sharing. For example, one way, it's a cryptographic technique that divides a secret value into multiple parts called shares, and each share of the original secret is distributed among several participants, which ensures that control over the secret value is shared and not held by a single entity, which may be attacked. You know, the risk there is higher if it is only a single entity. So you see here a very simple example. Actually, this graphic is borrowed from the Geeks website. You have this original secret. What does additive secret sharing do? It splits it in three, for example, different shares if you have three participants or peers. And if you add these three different shares, then you construct the original secret. Okay. So the control is distributed among more peers than only one. But what happens with conventional SMPC-FL implementations? In that case, we still have issues. Why? Because its client communicates directly with the aggregation server. As we said, the aggregation server is a single point of trust or even failure. The client communicates directly with the aggregation server after the local client model training in order to share its model parameters. This means that most SMPC-FL implementations rely on a centralized, as I said, or semi-trusted aggregator, which introduces a single point of failure and a trust bottleneck. And it also exposes the system to insider threats, collusion, attacks, node compromise, etc. So what have we introduced in Synthema that can alleviate these types of risks? A peer-to-peer SMPC protocol that has been implemented on top of the Flower framework, which still leverages additive secret sharing, but also uses peer-to-peer message passing across peers in order to construct a fully decentralized aggregation protocol, which is compatible with existing FL workflows. So you see here that in the example that I saw here with 6 clients, the clients did not only communicate during the aggregation process with the aggregation server, but they also communicate among themselves and share shares, okay? So each client contributes to computation by securely exchanging and combining secret shares, as you see here, with the dotted lines. With its peers and not only with the aggregation server. Now, this work has been already published in this publication, and you can access it for more details if you want. I will very briefly explain the process. We assume that we have indeed 6 clients. So in the first step, each client splits the parameter of the local training round in 6 parts because we have in total 6 clients. Then the clients distribute the shares to all other clients, as you see here in a peer-to-peer mode, keeping one for themselves. In the third step, each client holds only 1 share per parameter from the other peers, and it constructs here the total message. Local aggregation is performed at its client. And the fourth step, the clients send the local aggregated parameters that you see here to the central aggregation server in order for the aggregation server to, of course, compute, as you see here, the global model. And once this is computed, and the aggregation server, of course, receives all local parameters to compute it, then it sends it back to the clients to start a new training round. So you see here, actually, there are a lot of mathematics behind, but it would be too difficult to comprehend. You can refer to the publication. You see here also the entire process visualized when using 3 clients. So this ensures also that we don't have a single point of failure, the centralized aggregation server, and the control is set among all the clients as well. This ensures both security and privacy guarantees. There is no individual cell that leaks model updates, which protects the system from various kinds of attacks, a number of them actually inference attacks, etc., mentioned by Rudolf. The aggregation server cannot infer the origin, the peer that is, of the parameters, hence it does not need to be actually fully trusted. There is resilience to collusion because a large number of compromised or malicious parties is required to break security. The proofs of all these guarantees are in the paper. And when combined with differential privacy, as we do actually in Synthema, then security and privacy are significantly enhanced and will minimize the privacy risks. We do have actually experimental evaluation of the performance, both using the standard federated learning and the P2P SMPC federated learning. What we observe is that the model accuracy and loss are comparable among both approaches. And simply in the second case, in the peer-to-peer SMPC federated learning, we need some more training time, and the network traffic is increased. But as Rudolf mentioned, there is always a trade-off between securing privacy and having higher risk actually of privacy, lower or higher risk of privacy. So that said, this peer-to-peer SMPC protocol is now actually a Flower Hub application. Since Synthema is one of the early Flower Hub launch partners, we have a long collaboration with Flower Labs. And you can actually find it in Flower Hub. And it has been presented actually Synthema and this application and the participation to Flower Hub in the Flower AI Summit by Flower Labs. And finally, before closing, actually, I would like to say that these are not the only related work in privacy-enhancing technologies. We also have work being performed on anonymization and federated anonymization, which is one of the mitigation actually measures that Rudolf has already mentioned. This will be part of webinar 3 next Friday. And if you want also some additional read with respect to synthetic data in healthcare, where Synthema has been actually one core use case analyzing all the advancements in the area, but also the challenges, including regulatory and ethical and clinical ones, you may refer to this white paper that has been produced by BDVA. So that said, I have finished with my presentation. Of course, I'm open to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, for your presentation. So we don't have any questions on the chat. I don't know if anyone has a comment or question. And well, if not, you have all the contact details of the 3 speakers. And the upcoming days, you will find on our website the presentations of the 3 speakers and also the recording of this webinar. So if you have any doubt, you can write to them or also to ERN-Your-Blognet, and will be available. And well, that's it. So if we don't have any questions, we can finish here. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for the 3 speakers for these great presentations. And well, have a nice rest of the day and a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.